Now we're going to talk about the midpoint formula. Let's understand what the formula means. I'm going to turn this into a triangle. And if I know how long the line horizontal to the x-axis is, and I know how long the line parallel to the y-axis or the vertical, if I knew the length of that and I wanted to find the middle, I can average them, can't I? Whenever I want to find the average of something, I take all the numbers, I add them up, and I divide by the number of numbers I have. But here, I just have two numbers. I have an x1 value and an x2 value. And then this point right here, we'll call this y1. And then we have another point out here, and we'll call this y2. And then this point right here would be x2, comma, y2. And if I want to find the middle of both of these lines, can't I just take the average? I can add the two y values, divide by 2. That gives me the middle. This is the average of the two x values. And then this is the average of the y's. Let's do this problem. Find the midpoint of the segment from -3,2 to 4,6. Let me draw a picture instead of just using a formula. So we go -3, +2, and I am out here. Now here's my line, and somewhere in the middle here, let's say that's the midpoint, and I want to find it. Well, again, I can make my triangle. And of course, you don't have to do all this work. I'm just showing you so that it makes sense, you understand it, and it won't be hard for you to memorize that formula. Again, I have this point and this point. This is -3 and this is 4. And if I want to find the distance between those two, I can subtract them. So I know the difference between those 2 points is 7. If I use the formula, which is I add the two x values and I divide by 2, and then I add the two y values and divide by 2, what do I get? I get 1/2, comma, 4. Well, that makes sense, because if the distance between here and here is 7, we can just count it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Or another way to find the distance between 2 points is to subtract them. 4 minus -3 becomes 7. Half of that is 3.5, isn't it? Which means I'm going to go 3.5 this way. This is 3.5. And I'm going to subtract 3.5 from here, which gets me to 1/2. And that's my x value. And the middle of 2 and 6 is 4. It's 2 above the 2 and 2 below the 6. This would be my midpoint. Again, I'm not trying to say you should draw these triangles. I'm just trying to show you how it works. And the midpoint is, again, we take the average of the endpoints, which means I add them up and divide by 2 for both the x and the y separately. Again, we have this thing called the distance formula. For example, let's say I have a point here. I'll call it x1. I'll call this point x2. I'll call this point y1. And I'll call this point y2. And I want to know the length of that line. Not the midpoint, because the midpoint, we just add those 2 points together and divide by 2 for, but that's kind of a hard formula to remember until you realize where it comes from. So again, I'm going to make a triangle and I'm going to connect these points. And if I want to know the length of that red line, I just made a right triangle. And since I made a right triangle, if I call this A and I call this B and I call this C, most of you have heard this before. This is just the Pythagorean theorem. Remember, the Pythagorean theorem says I have a squared plus b squared equals c squared. Well, a is the distance between x2 and x1. And if I want to know the distance between two numbers, I just subtract them. If I want to know the distance between 1 and 4 is 3, because 4 minus 1 is 3. If I want to know the distance between -2 and +3, I still subtract. 3 minus -2 becomes 3 plus 2, or 5. I'll always know the distance between the two values. A is going to equal x2 minus x1, and B is going to equal y2 minus y1, the distance between those two values. And if I plug them in here, then what do I get? I get x2 minus x1 squared plus y2 minus y1 squared equals c squared, which is what I'm trying to find, is the length of c. That the Pythagorean theorem actually uses lengths. So the length of a squared plus the length of b squared always equals the length of c squared. But I want to know just what c is. How do I do that? I take the square root of both sides. I'm going to flip the equation around. So I have c is equal to the square root of x2 minus x1 squared plus y2 minus y1 squared. Well, what about plus or minus? Well, true, there is a plus or minus, except distance is always positive. I don't go a mile in one direction, and then if I'm coming back, I don't say -1 mile. It's still 1 mile. We talk about distances always as positive numbers. If it wasn't just that we were looking for the distance, we would have to put plus or minus. But since we're looking for the distance, it's just positive. So you can see that's how I get the distance formula. If you don't remember the distance formula, make a triangle and do the Pythagorean theorem. Here I have a equals -1, 5. And then we have another point at 4, -5. And our other point is down here. And we want to know the distance of that straight line that goes from one point to the other point, just by memorization, because I know some of you like to memorize things. I make my triangle. If I want to know the length of this line, here's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. A is equal to 5. And then I can count the y values. I'm starting here at -5, and I'm going all the way up to +5. And if I count, this distance right here is b, and it's going to be 10. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. I could count it, or again, I can just subtract one from the other, and I'll always get the distance. If I want to actually do this work now, I know a squared plus b squared equals c squared, where this is c, which I'm calling the distance. And a squared equals 25. B equals 10, so b squared equals 100. And that equals c squared. C squared is equal to 125. I'm going to take the square root of both sides. And I'm going to get c is equal to the square root of 125, which is equal to the square root of 5 times 5 times 5. For every 2 that are under the radical, I can cancel those and take it outside of the radical and then multiply by the square root of 5. The distance from one point to the other is c, which is 5 times the square root of 5, or we can call it d, or we can call it whatever you like, but that is the distance. Now, I'll do the same exact problem, just using the formula. If I know the formula, which is the distance, and now I really can remember it pretty easily because I know it's the square root of the difference between the x's squared plus the difference between the y's squared. And it doesn't matter which one you call 1 and which one you call 2, as long as you label it. If this is 0.1 and this is 0.2, that's fine. Then x1 is -1 and x2 is 4. Now we have the square root, x2, which I'm going to use b as x2. So I have 4 minus a, the x for a is -1, squared, plus y2. y2 is -5 minus, and y1 is +5. I square it. This is equal to the square root. 4 minus -1 is 5. 5 squared plus -10 squared. The square root of 25 plus -10 squared is still +100, which is equal to the square root of 125, which is exactly what I got. And then I already showed you how to simplify that, is 5 times the square root of 5. This should get you through 2.1. Have a great day.